Hello, everyone. Welcome to a special edition of Mining Now. Today on the show, we have Rogers and NORCAT doing a joint show. We're going to have Paul Howarth on. He is the Senior Director, Business Development and Product Commercialization at Rogers. And then Don Duval is the CEO at NORCAT. So they're going to be talking about some of their collaboration, but it's also the industry as a whole. Welcome, Paul. Welcome, Don.
Good morning to you both.
This is a
pleasure to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you on. This is a bit of a new one because usually we have people completely remote or in studio. So now I've got three cameras and two different. So if my eyes are wandering a little bit, stay with me. We kind of wanted to theme this episode, the sort of the future of mining. A lot of our episodes have that tinge, but a lot of them are technical discussions about what's sort of happening now, what's available to the market, and things like that. So I guess the first question, and Paul, I think I'll start with you, is from your perspective, and then Don, we'll just give it from yours. How do you see that the mining industry evolves? Maybe more from a communication standpoint, but just from what you've seen coming into the industry.
Sure. I would say, I think most people imagine, a mine site is obviously full of lots of physical labor, lots of people on there, massive equipment, explosions and things like that. What people don't see is that the mining industry has really been going through this massive digital transformation. Mm-hmm. They are just interested in cloud and mining data, I would say, and using data to increase their productivity, increase their safety on a mine site. And so, those mining operators today are talking about how do they get to Azure, how do they get to Google Cloud, how do they get to the AWS infrastructure, which really drives communication. So it's a really interesting transition that's going on in the industry right now. I'd say we're just sort of in the early days of it, but rapidly accelerating where, having connectivity to a mine site isn't just optional anymore. They actually need very, very high throughput, reliable connectivity to operate the mine in any fashion.
From a business development standpoint, is Rogers essentially following the demand in the market, as in 15 years ago, 10 years ago even, you might get one call and now all of a sudden you're getting 50. Is it that dramatic of a difference?
Yeah, it's probably not quite that dramatic. There's always been this underlying play in any of our businesses, really, where, is the connectivity getting to where the development is fast enough? Mm-hmm. Of course, these mine sites tend to be very geographically remote. Not always, but generally speaking, they tend to be remote in areas where there wasn't any coverage. Perhaps the only coverage would be satellite connectivity with some type of local Wi-Fi infrastructure. Over the last, probably 5 years at least, maybe as far as 10, people have started to look at, things like cellular technologies and how do we bring that to some of these remote locations to bring the same kind of robust, reliable connectivity that we have in urban markets mm-hmm. to these very remote mine sites. So, it's definitely probably the default position now. And so we're getting a lot more calls and inquiries about how we might do that. And, it's not without its complexities, right?
Mm-hmm. It's, I can imagine
flying to a remote place. I think before we went on air, I mentioned I have one client outside of the mining industry where we actually had to put all of the equipment on a ship mm-hmm. Because we need to get it to a very remote location and the ice will come in a couple of months. And there's no airfield to land the type of equipment we need to bring to that particular site. So definitely a huge uptick, and not just within Canada, outside of Canada. A lot of cases it's being pulled by activities that are going on, say in South America,
right,
Australia, maybe markets like Turkey, where they're already doing some of these things, and they're bringing that to Canada and asking us how can we help them with their operation
needing that infrastructure here in that place. Well, you said an interesting thing. It's a default now, as opposed to when I've been. I mean, now it's been probably 10 years since I've been, doing anything on a mine site, but it was, even back then, it was really just, can I make a call home? That's about at that time. Don, how about from your perspective, and I'm sure, this will speak directly to NORCAT, is even the evolution of mining, but really from like a workforce perspective, because we get a lot of people talking about on the show, they're trying to attract new people to the industry. Can you talk about the evolution of mining and the future of mining from that sort of workforce side of things?
Yeah, and I'll build on Paul's earlier comment that it's very astute to recognize that the global mining industry is undergoing this rapid transformation by the inclusion and adoption of new technologies, driven in part by shareholder pressure, competitiveness, productivity targets, safety, a whole array of factors. And what's unique about the mining industry is this transformation is really rooted in the fact that if you look at the last 30, 40, 50 years of the mining industry as a whole, it's really migrated from I would say, an insourced R&D model where historically a lot of these mining companies would build proprietary intellectual property with a team of engineers locked away looking to build new products. And that has kind of been divested in a fairly meaningful way over the last, again, 30, 40, 50 years, thereby giving rise to an outsourced innovation model whereby these mining companies still have intractable issues that they have to solve. But now, opposed to being builders of that tech, they have to become buyers. So as you parse that into kind of the talent question, it's really interesting what's happened. One, you're seeing a vibrant supply, service, technology ecosystem unlike any other time in the industry's history. So companies not unlike that of Rogers are being put in a position where they see a path to a customer, a path to implementation, a path to sell their product, because the mining companies need that technology to be productive, to be safe, to drive that competitive nature. And what that has done from a talent perspective, it's given rise to really unique, interesting, I'll say, career opportunities for a young graduate, be it from college or university, looking for a career, now have the option to work for innovative supply service tech companies,
right,
building solutions for the mining company. Not unlike, again, think of the unique opportunities within in a company like Rogers or teleremote autonomous system companies. Those are really interesting jobs to a new generation that doesn't want to spend 12 hours a day underground, working in that environment. And then subsequent to that, building on that, if you look at the mining industry, especially in developed economies with high labor costs and high energy costs, mining companies are forced into a position where no longer can they just pay workers more to do what might be perceived as a traditional, job, a traditional skilled labor job. Those workers have seen the emerging technologies. And if you want to, adopt and deploy these technologies as a mining company, no longer are you doing it exclusively for the productivity gains and, again, shareholder value and competitiveness gains. You're now doing it to win the battle for talent. Mm-hmm. Those are the jobs that young workers are looking to have, whereby if I can get involved in all else equal, a mining company that has put in, exceptional connectivity systems to enable emerging technologies to be used, that is going to compel a would-be worker to say, I want to work for that mining company versus one that hasn't done that. So it's really interesting what the technology transformation is doing on the talent attraction, but now you're also seeing it as a method of retention. People will continue to stay in those jobs, and money is not the primary driver. It's the environment in which they're working in, the people and the technology that they have deployed. So it's a really unique transformation that the mining industry is really going through, I would say, in the last 10 years. And it's, to Paul's point, it's only going to accelerate more.
Yeah, it's a good point on talent, Don, because it's the lines are blurring. I mean, the people that I would hire that would look at the technology are now the same types of people that some of these mines need to hire.
Right. And the tech companies that are servicing those mines that need to connectivity through Rogers.
It puts a lot of tension, as you're saying, Don, on that talent pool, because a mine site needs somebody that understands, machine learning and Python code. They also need to understand radio systems and lots of other technology, not just the technology of mining. They now need to know, like I mentioned, the cloud technologies and the software technologies. So, there's a lot of companies now all converging and looking for that same set of talent. And it's important, as Don said, to make sure that you're attracting the right people. And, I would say there's many, many exciting jobs for people now to live outside urban markets. I see it as a great thing.
Yeah, well, you're seeing, I mean, you see prices in some of these urban areas that have skyrocketed because people are, they're heading for the hills.
Ask Don. He lives a little remote.
Yeah, well, and if I build on that point, take a real unique, interesting made in Canada example where, the Musselwhite operation, it's about 500-600 kilometers as the crow flies north of Thunder Bay. And they had established a remote command center, creating jobs for young workers to operate machinery, mobile machinery within the remote fly-in, fly-out community through I'll call it urban command center within the confines of the city of Thunder Bay, where you can envision a team operating multiple pieces of machinery, be it through teleremote or autonomous vehicle systems, creating a really unique job that individuals want. Versus flying in for 2 weeks, spending your time at camp underground doing the mining cycle. So now you've created a really unique opportunity that is fundamentally rooted in the sophistication and resiliency of the communication infrastructure and the connectivity. Mining operations are not in urban centers. Communication and connectivity is critically important, not only within the confines of be it underground or on surface within that site, but you need the ability to tether it to a large urban center where that young generation wants to be. Those jobs are now being created. And what's really unique, not only are they inspired, they'll be retained. I would argue in developed economies, you can actually pay them less than if you were to fly them in. Mm-hmm. So money is not the motivator. It's this unique, I'll say, technology-inspired opportunity that create jobs that people will want. And mining companies are going to need, using that as an example with Musselwhite, they're going to need to continue to invest in technology that creates this pull for talent and retains them subsequent to that. Mm-hmm. So it's a really interesting thing. And I think it's salient to the conversation today, given the spirit of Rogers and connectivity and communication infrastructure. It is going to transform the battle for talent.
I wanted to it might be a bit of a chicken and egg question, but with the development of tech companies now providing technology to the mining operators rather than the mining operators having an internal development, I've had a lot of tech companies like that come on the show, and we have plenty more coming on. How important is it for them? Are they running in? And Don, I think you'd probably know this, and then maybe talk about sort of what needs to happen. Are they running into challenges where the mines don't have the connectivity to be able to service the technology that they've developed because so much of it is going back to cloud-based communication and things like that? Have you run into that, Don?
Absolutely. Yeah, the global mining industry is still at the nascent stages, I would say, of adopting and deploying these emerging technologies. And I think some of it is rooted in the sophistication, and please don't misinterpret this if you're on the mining company side. But given it's been migrated to an outsourced innovation model, whereby, to your point, Jared, the mining companies need to, procure, adopt, and deploy. Mm-hmm. The sophistication in which they do that is still developing. It's still somewhat nascent because historically they just built it and did it themselves. So this notion of, understanding the integration, the interoperability, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done there. If you look at the raw technology, and I'm curious to get Paul's thoughts on this, but if you take connectivity and communications and you just look at the technology unto itself that Rogers has and amongst their partners that they work with, I would say the technology is there. But I think the piece that really needs a fair bit more work is the change management, the interoperability, the integration, how it all works, getting the confidence and competence built in the skilled labor workforce that'll be using this technology. I don't think the mining industry has an innovation problem. I think it has a technology adoption problem. And that's why I think a lot of these technologies are there. So when you speak to other tech providers, be it in the communication space or other, I think this technology can be assessed as being phenomenal. But getting it adopted and deployed is a different part of the equation.
Mm-hmm. Well, I just to build on that question, I'm thinking specifically of these sensor technologies, monitoring technologies. Are you running into, have you run into either mines or other industries where they go, we've got this technology, we want to adopt it, or maybe we've got 10 on mining operations. You've got the processing,
Right.
the actual mining of bringing it out, all that sort of stuff. There's all these operations within the operation. So let's say they're adopting all these technologies. Have you run into it where they've got the technology, but they need that connectivity to make it happen?
Definitely, we see that. It fundamentally, Don sort of touched on it, that there, I would say it's just a question of experience, right? Before, so if the sensor company comes in, they're going to default to the communications infrastructure they're used to. That's often things that are available like Wi-Fi readily in an urban market. But when you get to an underground environment,
Right.
suddenly things aren't working so well. And, for us, we obviously, we operate Canada's largest cellular network. I mean, that's our experience. We understand that. But it's not just, people inside the mining industry don't necessarily understand the complexities of our technology, which is why we've packaged it to be a service, so they don't have to worry about the spectrum, the types of radios, the fiber optic cables. I mean, we'll take care of that design and we'll put it in. So there's an aspect of people are very comfortable with things that they work with in the typical enterprise and the carpeted areas like Wi-Fi or Ethernet cabling and things like that. They're less comfortable looking at 4 and 5G technology, but they're getting there. They're starting to see how they can do it. The other aspect of it, though, which is equally or even more important in my mind, is having the skills to translate a business case, a return on value or return on investment. That's critical certainly in my industry, right? I mean, Rogers doesn't allocate me capital to go build a product or something unless I can show that. Those are skills that the mining industry needs to build up. All heavy industrial industries, quite frankly, need to build up in how can they translate an interesting technology evolution into business benefit and hard dollars of benefit to the company, right? That's not an easy task, right? Because you need to be an expert in mining, for example, or the particular process you're trying to digitally transform. And then you have to be someone who has that unique blend of business experience, though, at the same time, to put it into sort of dollars and cents and say,
right,
look, if I put this $1 million of capital into this and this digital transformation, here's the safety improvement, and the safety improvement can be turned into dollars and cents by saying, here's the reduction in safety claims or the increase in productivity because I don't have downtime.
Right.
Someone's got to do that translation,
which is not always easy.
It's not difficult.
Yeah, you need someone who really understands each element to be able to sort of express and then present that to management.
You need someone who's reasonably well versed in the mining operations, for example, in the digital transformation, and how to turn that into a financial number, so that you can get the support of the executives to actually go forward. So it's a difficult one, and it's one that we actually spend, I would say, an equal amount of time with our customers on the technology that they need. We spend the same amount of time talking about the business benefit and how they can translate that into the correct business benefit to make the investment at all.
Yeah. Well, I'll say, Don, you're in a Rogers studio right now. So if you can get all of the people that are on our show to have that connectivity that we have, that would be great. All over the world.
This is amazing right here. This is a beautiful spot. I'm just going to hang out here when I'm in Toronto.
Let me know. I'll meet you there.
Well, and Jared, I was just going to build on one comment. The other interesting complexity is and absolutely agree with everything Paul mentioned. You have all these components, and the one thing that even adds a more interesting layer, and it's kind of a ages and stages. The global mining industry is really at the cusp of a continued expedited technology transformation. So the supply service technology ecosystem is growing by the week. So, the business case for mining companies to make a procurement adoption deployment decision, it's further complicated that in the long, sometimes arduous process of going through the business case, 6 months later, there could be half a dozen new products that are competitive to the ones that they currently assessed. And you see this just with the rise of venture capital and private equity being funneled into the tech ecosystem that serves mining as a primary industry. So now you're getting this infusion of cash to enable these supply service tech companies to do things quicker and faster And it's putting the buy side of the equation. The mining companies, they go through this whole business case, and all of a sudden 5 or 6 new vendors pop into the equation. It's like, my goodness, the mining industry isn't used to that. And so that sophistication of procurement and sourcing and deployment and adoption, it's still a learning curve. And I think it's going to be a little bit inefficient and messy probably for the next 10, 15 years until there's some rationalization in the supply service ecosystem. But it just adds another layer of complexity for these mining companies. And we see that daily or weekly at the Underground Center by kind of watching the connections between the buy and the sell side.
Yeah. And that's the thing. And I was actually curious about, do you sort of have to filter out trend as opposed to demand, in the sense that there might be all these ideas and maybe they've even been funded, but sort of filtering it down to say, these are the things that the mining industry really needs right now. Maybe they'll need this thing in 20 years, but they need this yesterday.
Yeah, the way that, so we very often get asked for our opinion on what do you perceive or, do you believe as NORCAT as the emerging trends in mining? And, there's multiple ways to deduce that, but the only way that we really focus on that's arguably differentiated is we gather anecdotal data from the activity that occurs in the NORCAT Underground Center. We aspire to be this one-stop shop for the future of mining. We enable tech companies to do, to develop, test, and demonstrate. We bring the buy side in. And in that, activity, we have this unique, I'll call it perch or perspective, where we can monitor and maybe a glorified version of eavesdropping into the correspondence from both the buy and the sell side. Mm-hmm. So we hear the questions that the mining companies, are asking. We understand their innovation priorities because we listen and we hear. And then coupled with that, we get to see the sell side coming in, developing, testing, demonstrating what they believe are technologies that are poised to transform the industry. So we formulate an opinion around what we see as demand from both sides. And we use that to inform our opinion on what are the emerging trends. And what I can tell you, again, in the spirit of expedited transformation, it's no longer changing about every 2 or 3 years like it maybe historically did 20, 30 years ago in the mining industry. It's changing quarter by quarter, I would say. Mm-hmm. We have different opinions on, new emerging technologies, products, or services that are being either sought or being developed, and usually you would hope they would be concurrent, so there's a meaningful business equation to do it. But that's how we formulate it. So the demand informs the trend opinion that we formulate.
Yeah, I'll add to that, Don. Yeah, first of all, I mean, everything Don said is what makes NORCAT such a great facility for Rogers to be part of, right? So we've invested there specifically because we want to be at that intersection where people are figuring out those new business cases for digital transformation, figuring out what technology works both below the surface and above the surface, right? I mean, eventually that stuff has to come to the surface. And so we're sort of interested in that. But there are some real basic things that still have to happen on a mine, and have been happening. So, communications, right, are critically important. Staying in touch with those employees, knowing where those employees are, knowing where they are relative to pieces of equipment, whether they're automated or not.
Right.
Those are some just no-brainers, right? That a robust communications infrastructure can allow a mine to do. And so that's where 4 and 5G technologies are really playing today. They have the opportunity to do so much more, and that's what Don's talking about. Like, there's just so much more, but the table stakes are sort of already there. There are some basic things that mines have to do to stay operational, that can only be made better by very consistent, reliable communications across all of the operations. And so, in a lot of cases, the work we're doing sort of starts there. It's not necessarily some giant transformational thing. And then to Don's point, the things that are transformational, you almost want to run them in a product sense. I do run a product team. We call it agile methodology, where we build a backlog of things that customers have said they want, features or capabilities, but we actually look at it every 90 days. We don't commit, to a whole year's worth of things. We might plan out a year or more, but every 90 days we go back and we look at it and we say, these 3 things that we thought were going to happen, they're not really starting to happen, but this thing, is suddenly become really important, and we'll put our effort in there, and every 90 days bring the team back together. And I think really that's what the mining industry is going to have to adopt as well.
Mhm.
There's obviously some very long-term things a mine has to do. Let's face it, these are 20, 30, 40, 50, even longer investments that they're making.
Yeah.
But, transformation, I always say, it sneaks up on you,
Yeah.
right? It's not something that's just here. It sneaks up on you. So those little incremental things that they can do once they've got that infrastructure
Yeah.
in place, that's really the approach they should be taking. It's not a flash
Yeah.
and suddenly you've got a digital mine.
Yeah.
It's get the basics working much better.
Yeah.
And then start introducing those things. It's kind of a flywheel.
Yeah. It's kind of ties back to what Don was saying too, though, is that it's like it sneaks up on you, but then what I find is then it just explodes. It's like you end up with this whole plethora of options all of a sudden because the infrastructure is right. Now we have all this connectivity. You can track all this information. So now all of a sudden you can track your ore, your processing, your chemicals, your people,
Yeah.
your machines, and all of a sudden you went from having this much data to it just grows, just like that.
Yeah, I was around when Dr. Jeffrey Hinton created some of the first machine learning algorithms, not all that long ago, and people were saying, well, when are we going to have AI? When are we going to have all this stuff? And it's just been creeping up on us, right? We now have better translations. We have, Luke Skywalker pushed into a movie
Yeah.
looking like he's 19 years old, all using machine learning. It just creeps into society. And it's the same thing with these complex business processes. It just doesn't take overnight. Like you said, you've got these mountains of data and you literally start mining the data now.
Yeah. John, I wanted to ask you, how important is it with you having that operating mine and getting some of this equipment tested and then tying that back to the connectivity with Rogers? How important is it? I mean, it probably I guess it's probably self-evident that these companies can actually have something that's been in a mine, so that a mine is not trying to adopt this new technology that hasn't actually been tested in an operating environment.
Yeah, well, I hope it's important because that's our business.
Yeah. So do we, by the way, John.
Yeah. No, it's a great question. The investments that we've made in what we define as our unique asset. So NORCAT is a group of companies, and the underground mine falls under our innovation mandate and our skilled labor training and development mandate. So it really serves two purposes. But akin to this conversation, we really aspire to be that, global one-stop shop for all that is the future of mining. And the root of that is, as an innovation center, we're the only one in the world that essentially owns and operates, and I use the term ownership loosely in that it's a long-term lease with Glencore.
Right.
But the purpose of that asset, we drill, we blast, we muck, so it runs the production cycle. We have an offtake agreement with Glencore. We sell them the ore. But the primary purpose really is to enable tech companies, again, to develop and test and then subsequently demonstrate and showcase. We have made sizable investments in this infrastructure over the last, I would say, 5 to 7 years in a meaningful way. In our context, meaningful is millions of dollars, not tens of millions, but millions. And the root of that is based on, I'll call it anecdotal yet robust surveys, where we went out about 10 years ago and solicited insight from both the buy side and the sell side to test that hypothesis I mentioned earlier. Does the mining industry have an innovation problem? And we concluded after about 250, 300 interviews, so data-driven, that no. The technology then wasn't as sophisticated as it is now, and that will continue, but it's not an innovation problem. It's a technology adoption problem. And when you ask the question, both to the buy and the sell side, if that be true, what is taking so long?
Right.
Why does it take a large mining company such a long time? And the feedback that came back, and again, it was congruent amongst both the buy and the sell side, is that before someone in the mining industry makes a purchase order decision, they want to know that the technology works. They want to know that it's been de-risked. They want to know that it works and been de-risked in an operating environment,
right.
Not a parking lot, not a laboratory. Whilst that's important, that is a very early stage that can't really play into influencing a procurement decision, or usually it would disqualify it in that context. So this notion of being an operating mine is critical to our niche role to expedite technology adoption in the global mining industry. And we have validated that it does matter. So, and Paul could attest to this, I believe. If you are underground demonstrating a battery electric LHD or something operating on a teleremote autonomous system with Rogers connectivity infrastructure, and you're physically in your personal protective equipment, you're underground, you're having a conversation between buyers and sellers, we have validated time and time again through the psychology of procurement that it does matter. If we were just a tunnel, the value proposition would not be there. But because we run the full mining cycle, we adhere to all the regulatory framework, we become a first reference customer for both big and small, domestic, international companies that use our facility to then build a narrative, validate all of my aforementioned comments, and then use that as a springboard to get to the next big, meaningful sale. So we are going to continue to invest in this infrastructure because we're hearing from the community it does matter.
I want to build on that. Is from Roger's perspective, when you're going in to like that operating mine now and working with NORCAT, I guess that's an R&D as well for you, because you're seeing these environments that now, and you can now meet that demand and match it up with your technology to go, okay, this is a probably a common thing in that you're going to run into a lot of underground mines, especially if they adopt more of these available technologies. So to sort of become a good feedback loop for you.
Yeah, it's it's a tremendous asset, as Don talked about. Look, the mining industry has built up regulations and processes and procedures over hundreds of years, quite frankly, and all of those things are in place to protect, people, environment, assets, investors. Like they're there for very, very good reasons. And if you're going to get involved in transformation, you need to check all those boxes, as Don said. You can't do that in a parking lot or a laboratory. The only place you can do that is in a facility that's actually doing those activities. Like I'll get asked quite frequently, Don, well, what happens when we do blasting? Are your radios just going to come flying off the walls? Well, no, they're mounted with 6-foot pins, just like you would put the mesh up in your underground facility. But why don't you come to NORCAT and take a look at that? Why don't you come there the day that they are ready to do the blast?
Right.
And then let's go down and take a look and see what happened to that technology during that event. There's no other way, just no other way I could ever show anybody that that we're doing this correctly. And then there's things where perhaps we want to look at changing the regulations, and you want to do that very, very carefully. But you can't test that unless you're in a working environment. So there's very strict regulations, for example. And Don, you're familiar with, you don't want to be, you can't today turn on your radios that we would use for communications to their highest power, because blasting detonators are also wirelessly controlled in a mining environment. But those are things we'd love to look at because they have a real, they have an impact on that business case, right? With lower power equipment, that means we need more equipment. More equipment means potential more maintenance. So, that's an area that we'd love to look at, but do it very carefully. Do it in a real operational environment where we could show that this is unequivocally true. And just lastly, anybody who's in the mining industry expects you to be able to walk a mile in their shoes, right? I mean, the very first step we took, even prior to partnering with Don, is my entire team went to Don's facility, and we were trained to be underground. Now, I don't want to be a miner. We're not trained to be miners, but we're trained to be underground and to be safe, because we wanted to understand, what does it look like?
Yeah. Who are we actually talking to?
Why does it really matter that this stuff be reliable? It matters because when there's a fire underground, we think, okay, fire is a danger. Well, it's smoke, we learn, right? For example, that's going to kill most of those people. And why getting communications at the end of the drift where it maybe goes around the corner or something is so important. Because that's, inevitably where someone will get injured. So it's I can't stress enough how important it is to put the technology where the people are going to use it in a real environment. And it's not just that it technically works, that it fits with those regulatory and processes that have been tested for hundreds of years, quite frankly, to stop people from getting injured and more likely killed, because these are very dangerous places. So,
Yeah.
so I definitely echo Don. You can't test this in a parking lot. Of course, we could show underground in a shopping mall or in a subway tunnel or on a highway going through.
But it's just not the same thing.
It's just not the same thing at all.
Yeah.
It's absolutely not. And there's a hypersensitivity associated with, again, the tech ecosystem selling, especially into the underground mining, where, I think there's sometimes not naivety, but there's sometimes a misunderstanding just how complex the underground environment is.
Right.
So, even more so than open pit or surface mining, there's a sensitivity on the buy side of the equation that they want to know that it works in an operating environment that has the humidity, has the seismic activity on occasion, has all these variables that really make it a much more complicated environment. And one of the things that was mentioned on the data side that Paul made mention of, that I think is a really interesting example of the importance of, I think the terms reliability and resiliency was mentioned a few moments ago. A lot of these mining operations are seeking more effective ways to improve productivity. And one of them is, more focused extraction. And there's actually a Vancouver-based, Jared, technology company called MindSense that does ore characterization in real time, kind of a surface scan of, you envision when you do a blast, you pick up a bucket of muck. And it has technology that can kind of do a rudimentary scan to determine what is the concentration of whatever sought, commodity you're looking at. So use nickel as an example. So just envision the scenario where the operator picks it up, does a quick scan, and let's say the quality of the nickel in that is not worth hoisting to the surface and then running through the grinding, milling, refining process, because there's just not enough in there to justify the cost in doing that. Thereby, the equivalent activity, say they pick up a bucket and it's high concentration of nickel based on the scan, well then hoist that one up, put the waste aside, don't waste the time and labor. Think of the importance of resiliency and reliability of the communication infrastructure network to not only inform the operator of that equipment, but also to inform the command center on surface and perhaps downstream, the trucks that might be waiting. Yep. And so, Paul could probably comment more, but he used the terms reliability and resiliency, arguably incremental innovation to a lot of this connectivity. But I think Rogers has done an exceptional job conveying to the market that these use cases are going to require a backbone that can do and enable these things, because the minute that network falls short because you misunderstood or didn't fully appreciate the underground environment, that vehicle might stop because it doesn't know what to do, because the infrastructure for communication has been challenged. That costs hundreds of thousands of dollars an hour. It can't happen.
Right.
So it's just an interesting example of the, doing it in an operating environment as a use case will validate all the things that you can't take the risk once you deploy it in a large-scale production mine.
Yeah, I'm glad you used MindSense, because now I can do a shameless plug that you can watch that episode about their technology on Mining Now. They're a very neat company, very neat what they're doing. So I was going to actually ask you, because Don just mentioned the all the way down the line, the vehicle picking it up. And you actually have a use case going, let's go above surface, where you connected, it was an actual road. And and I saw it on your website as well. We were chatting about it outside the studio. And that really became a safety thing, because when you increase capacity in an operating mine, you're increasing the amount of vehicles going back and forth. You might be increasing workers. You might private vehicles, the mine vehicles going back and forth. It becomes there's a lot of activity. That becomes a safety issue. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, it's a good point. We've talked a lot about the importance of the communications infrastructure on the mine itself, but you can't forget that all of that ore or refined material has to get off the site. All of the supplies and equipment need to get onto the site. And then arguably the most expensive asset in any mining operations is the people. They need to get there safely. And often those are very long remote roads. I think the mine you're referring to is on our website's Detour Lake. It's a Agnico Eagle operation. And in that case, we collaborated with them to cover, it's about a 200 kilometer it's called a highway, but it wouldn't be, something that we would typically drive on. And there was no communications infrastructure. Not only that, there was no there was no electricity either. So this whole 2 kilometer path, there was no way to communicate with those employees either on the shuttle or in their individual vehicles. So if something went wrong, it could be hours until the next person traveled down that road. And often on some of these roads, you can't travel them at night. So it could be literally the next day before you're out there. So if you want to increase production, you've got all this great digital transformation going on, and you need to increase the number of shifts or the employees to take advantage of that. You need that communications infrastructure to get people to and from the site as well. And so that's what we did there. We were actually put up our public cell sites in that case. But those public cell sites, there's no power. So they're actually solar powered along with a little bit of wind. And if those two don't work, there are batteries. And then ultimately we've got propane there, but we've got another thing that's very interesting in mines is a very ESG friendly solution, right? So we're not running diesel, for example, 24 hours a day to keep these things operational. That was really important to Agnico Eagle, that we do the least amount of harm as we possibly could. And so that drove us to build these sort of standalone sites that are capable of operating with wind and solar, ultimately a little bit of battery if we need to. And we've since taken that technology and deployed it here on the West Coast, where we are today on the Highway of Tears, the exact same solution that mining actually drove us towards. We're actually now deploying as part of our standard offer in areas like the Highway of Tears. We're the same situation. We have very remote highways traveled by the public, but we had no power, and we're now able to bring that. So it is critical. And then ultimately, those employees go back to offices that are in, Timmins in Ontario or Vancouver. And so, being able to tie the public infrastructure in to the mine site infrastructure doesn't seem important until, you think about push to talk. You want push to talk on the mine, but perhaps the general manager of the mine's off-site at head office today, but there's an incident or something going on. You want that push to talk radio to go off. And that's what we can do as Rogers. We can really blend the private infrastructure that's meant for mining. We can bring it together with our public infrastructure to give them just a complete ubiquitous set of communications, whether they're on that mining road, whether they're in head office, or whether they're actually on the mine site itself.
It's amazing what can be done now. And I mean, of course, this conversation could continue on and probably will continue on. But I wanted to kind of wrap up with kind of a very simple question and just a perspective question. Don, we'll start with you. Where is the mining industry going in the sense that in 20 years, will autonomous haul trucks be standard? Will, like MineSense technology, the ore sorting, will that become a regulatory standard? I mean, of course, you don't have a crystal ball, but will those become regulatory standards? Because if they're not, of course, if there's a business case that says, well, we'll just process more and to get to our numbers. Processing is so expensive that likely wouldn't happen, but let's say it did. Will those become regulatory demands? And then the part two of that question, over to you, Paul, is how far away infrastructure-wise would we be in place from that? So we'll start, Don, with you on that question.
Yeah, so given the expedited transformation of technology development for the mining industry, that's arguably somewhat new in the grand scheme of the scale of time. I can say with certainty right now, the regulations are not keeping up with the pace of technology development deployment. There are questions that governing regulating bodies, be it provincial or federal, are struggling to answer because they are just not equipped in the infrastructure of the policies to answer, can you do this or not do this? So they're working very hard through various provincial mining associations as well as other regulatory bodies to help answer that question. In terms of the crystal ball, though, I think I can, at least based on the feedback that I get from the mining companies, the buy side, as to where the trends are going, that should have sensitize the policy developers to know what they need to think about, is really rooted, I think, in three key areas. One, I think you're going to see continued growth of electrification across all mining operations, especially in developed economies. I think that's going to happen at an unprecedented rate, especially in Canada and Australia out of the gate. I think you're going to see a lot more so in the underground mining around this move towards continuous mining, continuous cutting. So kind of no longer the drill blast muck and hard rock mining, but more akin to the soft rock where it's just continuous. And then the third pillar, I think you're going to see a ton of development in communication infrastructure. I think combined, if I were to have a crystal ball, the regulatory policies are going to have to figure out how do we create an environment there that will ultimately, in the mine sense example I gave, reduce waste. It'll be more focused mining. You'll have more characterization, better access to data, being able to utilize that data. And ultimately, you'll be able to get workers out of environments that pose any type of hazard or risk associated with that job. So the mine of the future, in my opinion, is going to be one that is continuous. It's going to be electric. You're going to have a huge degree of autonomous and tele-remote systems. You're going to have fewer workers underground or in the open pit. And you're going to have the ability to do so in a competitive way. And I think the regulations will evolve to really encourage, especially the developed economies, to adopt that.
So in that sense, and you think those regulations jump from being a, like you talked about, like the wireless of blasting and the communication needs to be basically at different levels. Do those regulations become a demand though, that you need to have that? Or do they become a way, just a framework for implementing?
No, it'll be a framework for those technologies, because you wouldn't want to have a regulatory framework dictate this type of mining method that would then require this type of technology. You want to leave a little bit of white space to enable creativity and trial and error and piloting, and those are the key trends I see now. Jared, if we do this interview 5 years from now, there might be something entirely different, but they need the framework to enable companies to expedite decisions, to invest in R&D. Test and develop. If the policies are going to be prohibitive out of the gate and not have flexibility to evolve, it's going to create challenges. So I think the role of policy is to really be in tune with the emerging technologies, understand who's adopting, deploying, what are they learning, and then create the framework to really allow those emerging trends to go full speed. And as a nation, if I think, mining is a core contributor to our country's GDP. We are a resource-based economy, like it or not. Mining is critical to our future, and the amount of mineral potential we still have as a country is unbelievable. Yeah. We are a global leader in this. The regulatory framework needs to ensure that this technology transformation can happen faster, more efficient, and also encourage creativity. So many of these companies don't make it on the supply service tech side, but that's okay. We need to really push that culture of let's try it, let's test it, let's develop it and see how it unfolds. And the regulations need to try to keep up to enable them to do that.
Right. On the infrastructure side, on the communication, that was one of the 3 pillars that Don mentioned. So we'll wrap up with that question. From an infrastructure standpoint, from your perspective, what will it look like in 10 years, or even what is the potential? How much development could happen to create that connectivity? I mean, Canada's a big place.
I'm like Don. Whatever I say will be wrong, but the good news is I will be retired in 10 years. I half joke it's my last G of the 4 or 5G type space. But first of all, I just love to pile on Don's comment that like mining is critical to the GDP of this country. And it's important to me personally and important to Rogers that innovation happen here. We want the world to come to Canada to do this because we are the best at it. It is the best opportunity for a mining company to innovate and learn about it. If you're in Australia, let's do that here. If you're in Brazil, do that here. I'd love to be exporting what we learn at the NORCAT facility globally. And that's really the point of our collaboration, is to make sure that it happens. In terms of communications infrastructure, again, the regulations, are not a constraint. In fact, they often drive innovation, right? Those, if we can't increase the power because people are underground and it could interfere with blasting, and as Don said, well, maybe the answer is we innovate and get the people out of underground. Maybe it drives the adoption faster. So you don't necessarily have to change the regulation. They're there, like I said, to protect people, the environment, investment. or assets. But it might just mean you have to change the way you do it. So for communications, it's clear that the demand for bandwidth in any industry, mining included, is just going to keep doubling every 3 years. No matter what we do, we're going to need more information. There's going to be things that track assets, and we're going to need to know where those assets are. There's going to be things like mine sense that was mentioned. There's going to be already what mines are using drones both on the surface and above ground. They're taking things like really sophisticated spectral imagers, for example.
Oh, that stuff's crazy.
And a spectral imager uses an incredible amount of data that it pushes out of it. So the only thing I can predict is that more bandwidth wins every time in my near 40 years in this industry. The need for bandwidth has never gone away, and the need for bandwidth to continue to increase has never stopped. And in the case of what's going on in mining, we're really just talking about pushing that to different places, doing it wirelessly because things are in motion. A mine is a dynamic site, whether it be underground or on the surface. We're changing the terrain. And I'd echo Don's comments that, technology, communications or otherwise, is just going to allow the mine to very specifically go after the ore. It's getting better and better and better at finding exactly where they need to push the drill. Looking at the muck, for example, and deciding where you should push it next. It's, gone are the days of we're just going to find a deposit, hope for the best as we start digging. And that's a good thing, but it's going to need a lot of technology to do that. And you're going to need a lot of bandwidth, which means you're going to need that connectivity. And so in the future, we're in a 4G world today with 5G emerging. Of course, there will be 6G or 7G or something in the future. We can't predict what that'll look like yet, but it will drive more bandwidth. That I can guarantee.
Yeah. So I guess I will make this my last question, but I have to ask it then. When you're setting up an infrastructure plan for mine, then, and they're saying, well, we need this much, but we'll do this much. Are you saying, well, yeah, but you should invest in this much? Like, because that business case you're talking about, that seems like that would be a challenge because what they might need because that bandwidth. So I just maybe if you touch on that.
Sure. And it's a fair question, right? Like there's always that bit of push and pull in how much do we buy for the future?
Yeah.
And how much do we buy in the future? And so that's just a careful discussion with each customer. In terms of how much they want to do now. But the great thing about cellular networks in general is you build them in layers.
Okay.
There's multiple what are called frequencies or spectrum bands that you use. There's always more being made available over time. And that's where the bandwidth comes from. So
okay, so it's not like being within a city and like you're sort of limited if you live in a certain community unless that infrastructure is already put in. You're sort of limited there.
Yeah,
it's a bit of a different setup.
In this case, we would engineer it for teleremote or remote pilot, whatever the client is looking for, and then make sure that the assets are available in the future. Again, one of the things with technology is you don't want to buy too early ahead of it because it's generally getting faster. Cost per bit is generally dropping. So it's honestly just a balancing act between how much do we put in right now and how much do we layer in. But on the surface for an open pit mine, if you've built the towers, the monopoles, or the guy structures, whatever you need to do that, it's simply mounting another radio is not actually that big a deal.
It's that initial infrastructure that's your
initial infrastructure, the place to mount it, the fiber optic cabling or microwave or whatever you do. That's kind of the basic you got to put in place. But adding another radio because you need more capacity, or in cellular terms, sometimes we add what are called sectors, or change the tilt or add antennas, those types of things. Those are things that we can layer on in the future if they need those additional capacity.
Okay, that's a great way to wrap up. Thank you both. Now, of course, you're talking about that infrastructure. Now I've got about 10 questions that I want to start going on. So I'm going to stop here and thank you both. Thanks for coming into our studio, Paul. Thank you, Don, for joining us from, you're in Toronto, right?
I'm in the Rogers studio.
Nice. Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So thank you, everyone. And thank you for everybody, from Rogers and NORCAT and our team, Gowdy's over here running the monitors, for helping us put all this together. Behind the scenes, there's a lot of people that put even this little show together. So thank you to everyone. And thank you, everybody, for watching. We will see you on the next episode of Mining Now.